Second lead-off question on climate adaptation and the London Fire Brigade. All questions relevant to that will be welcome immediately afterwards. And it's in the name of Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you very much, Chair. London Fire Commissioner, how is the London Fire Brigade adapting to the needs of our climate emergency, and how are they prioritising that?
So obviously we've given some part of this answer in respect to flooding, but I think it's worth considering the very real impact it's already having. So climate change is quite simply giving rise to more extreme weather events. So whether hot, dry summers, so I think we had close to 4,000 grass fires last year inside the London M25 area. That's more than any other service area in the country. Those fires in themselves can have a very profound impact on local communities and the health of local communities. That's one example. If we think about flooding specifically, July 21, over a 4-hour period, we received 1,755 calls related to flash flooding and actually attended 1,430 incidents as a result, a number of which were life-threatening. So climate change is real and is already having an impact. We've already talked in detail about flooding, recognising the time pressures within the plenary. We're also doing other things. So our assessment of risk has been updated to take a far greater account of future risks and where they might develop. We recognise that climate change it can impact the safety of our citizens in different ways. So, for example, where there's going to be pressure in other parts of the world, more significantly around climate, what does that do to our security? What does that do to the counter-terror threat, to the movement of people, the pressure it brings on London? We have introduced a zero-emission pumping appliance project, which is the first of 3 projects under the Brigade's ultra-low emission fleet programme, because we can see that we will have to move to a zero-emissions fleet at some point, and we're working closely with colleagues in the GLA to think about how we provide the infrastructure to that and how that work will support the Mayor's strategy to make London a zero-carbon city by 2050. I mean, just as a niche thing, we understand also how we present ourselves and communicate is important so that we take a lead role in London. So I'm really pleased to confirm that LFB has been accepted as part of this year's Chelsea Flower Show in May, where actually we're going to be showing how gardens can be designed to mitigate the risk of flooding, because actually surface water flooding is a very real threat in London. The extent to which people have tarmacked their drives, I know it sounds like a small thing, but you do that in aggregation across millions of properties. That is one of the reasons we saw such terrible flash flooding. So it's how you can make your front gardens and your back gardens a more climate-friendly place. In effect, we have a sustainable development strategy covering from 2016 to 22, which brings together emerging issues with existing strategies and activities across the brigade. It supports the wider sustainability agenda under one strategic approach.
Thank you, Commissioner. And it's really good to hear that this is obviously a priority for you, and you know, that's all really good stuff. When I asked the Mayor about this last month, he said that the LFB will have to change, the demands on it will change because of the changing climate, and that's very much echoed in what you just said. Now, the volume of calls that you got, over 1,000 a day last year on particular days, what kind of extra demands does that put on the Fire Brigade, that sheer volume?
Well, I mean, it was actually over a 4-hour period, nearly 2,000 calls, so it's extraordinary. That is the busiest call period we've had, really, in recorded history. So if that's a taste of what's to come, and we've seen very significant flooding, not just in London, but in other parts of the UK year on year, then we've had to think about our resilience in the control room, how we share that burden across other control rooms. We will, at some point, I think, need to continue to lobby government, as we do currently around the statutory duty for flooding, for example, and also build a recognition of climate change into national reform and the framework that supports fire services nationally. To be fair, colleagues in central government are engaged with this and thinking about where that might take the fire service nationally.
Thank you. Now, Fiona, turning to you and looking particularly at resilience. Last week at Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee, I asked the Commissioner about the fact that traditionally fire brigades, in most of the public's mind, have gone and put water to fires. Now they're having to learn to take out, water out. And the Commissioner said to me that he believes that the skills are there in the Fire Brigade already because they've been doing this for a long time. Looking more broadly than flooding, so we had the grass fires at Wanstead Flats, and of course we've got the surface water flooding as well. What skills or gaps do you think London might have in making sure we're resilient to the changing climate?
I think one of the things I do in my capacity as chair of the London Resilience Forum is ensure that all the relevant plans are in place, and every single we meet. The London Resilience Forum meets 3 times a year, but there's a lot of work that goes on in between where members will work together to look at what resources are needed. That's not necessarily going to just be one agency. So that exercising and the working through the strategy is really important. What I would say is that at the moment there's no shortage of exercising in real time. So, for example, the fires that the brigade had to deal with at Wanstead Flats got a lot of publicity, but last year there were also quite high levels of wildfires that the brigade had to deal with. So I think it would be worth you sort of doing a specific session or meeting people relevant at the brigade to talk that through. The other way that the brigade ensures that they have the experience is by going and helping in other areas of the country and actually other areas of the world. So last year I was really proud to hear about the work that the London Fire Brigade did going to Greece to help with the wildfires in Greece. But I think wildfires sound like there's something that happens elsewhere, but actually they're an annual event here in London, as are the floods now. And I think that the making sure that those plans are in place and they're exercised and that reviews take place is one of the key ways that we can make sure that London is ready for the next event. And with my colleague Shirley Rodriguez, we've held a number of round tables which effectively formed a working group. The first one was led by the Mayor, and then Shirley and I have sort of carried on throughout the year, where actually partners have really looked at how we get under the issues that come up through surface water flooding and making sure that this year people have worked through quite a lot of those issues in advance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Deputy Mayor. Can I also ask, at these roundtables, has there been a discussion if there was a chain of events? So, for instance, if there was a wildfire and flooding at the same time or within very close proximity of each other?
Not specifically, but the London Resilience Group do look at cascading events, and we do a lot of work around concurrency. We've had to deal with a lot of concurrent events, not least sort of we had COVID and Brexit and so forth, and then you get sort of other flooding events in the middle of it. So the partnership is very experienced in managing and the stresses and strains of managing concurrent events, and I'm confident that's something that people are prepared for. But we do look at how cascading events or concurrent events will impact the ability to respond. Obviously, it does put pressures on the partnership, but those are ones that we work through, and most agencies will have more than one person that they could put up for a response or a strategic coordinating group on a particular issue. Thank you.
Thanks. And we know from COVID that the government just didn't seem to be worried about pandemics before COVID, and now obviously it's very much at the forefront of worry because it's just happened. And I worry with climate, it's a similar thing, that people often think it's always rained, so this isn't going to happen to me. And I've actually done some polling which suggests that Londoners are worried about climate risks, but actually they think the likeliness of a climate risk happening to them is quite low. What work is there being done in kind of awareness to make people know what their climate risks are?
I'd have to get some more information through on that, both from the new resilience team, but also from Shirley Rodriguez. But what I'd say is that actually those climate risks affect those Londoners with the least economic resilience. So, for example, those who are least able to put in their own adaptations, such as air conditioning or solar panels or so forth. And I think that the focus of what we do needs to make sure that the disproportionate impact of climate change doesn't disadvantage those Londoners who are already disadvantaged. Thank you.
Commissioner.
Really, it was just to that specific point. We've got a communication strategy around this, so we communicate regularly about the dangers of grass fires, how you might make your home more resilient in the context of flooding and the risks of flooding, how it might happen. So we know that we've got to take responsibility as a public body, and particularly in our role as a fire service, to communicate with the public to start to exemplify those risks which we think are emerging and growing.
I think that's a really interesting point too, because people can know they're at risk and then they can be paralysed with fear, and we see this with the climate emergency more generally. Now, obviously, we need the systemic change, and I'm glad to see that you're on that. In terms of people's personal responsibility, which it can't just be on personal responsibility, but in terms of what they can do, to either of you really, or both of you, what can people personally be doing to make sure that they're being resilient in terms of changing climate?
I think it's doing things, sorry, Commissioner, it's doing things like making sure that you've thought through what would happen if your property or your home was affected by flooding. Making sure, as the Commissioner said, that you try to ensure that you haven't just concreted over what is effectively a sink area if your front garden or back garden is flooded. And I think you see increasingly people use AstroTurf in their gardens. I mean, what's that about? That's completely sort of reversing the resilience that a garden allows you to have. It's about insulation and making sure that people have access to insulation, and it's about people understanding their own personal risk. And I think that's one of the things that we're expecting to come through the government's new resilience strategy, is people getting an understanding of their own personal risk in relation to a whole host of risks, whether that's climate change or how they would respond if they were unfortunate enough to get caught up in a terror attack. Thank you.
Commissioner, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nothing other than to say that I think it would be useful to write to you with the sort of communication we've already sent out, which is all about small practical steps that can keep yourself safer and prevent both the danger of fire and the danger of flooding.
I'd really appreciate that. Thank you, and happy to share it with the whole committee, obviously, Fire Resilience and Emergency Planning. On adaptation reporting, Deputy Mayor, we've had a report from Thames Water and Network Rail, particularly looking at adaptation. Is there a way that we could look at risks of a London level and get some definitions of what our exact risks are and what the scale of those are?
We do have a London community risk register. I don't have all the details with me here, but I'd be happy to sit down with the Assembly member and go through that, maybe with the head of the London Resilience Group, John Hetherington, who I think you'd be interested to talk to in any case. Thank you.
I'd really appreciate that meeting. And then just moving to finally, this is something I brought up before, but I'm particularly worried about instance, and this is largely from what's happened in Germany, where there's sustained rainfall overnight, perhaps when we're not expecting it, and older people or vulnerable people or disabled people, or all three of those, are stuck in their homes and can't get out. Now, I think the last time I asked you about this, you said this is at a local borough level and for people to have their personal evacuation plans. How confident are you that each borough is doing that to the level that they need to do that?
Well, I mean, they've given us assurance. I think they've got lead people, they've got lead officers and a lead politician at London councils. So I think they are working through that, but you'd need to speak to London councils directly about the exact processes they go through.
Do you think there's a role as Deputy Mayor to show kind of pan-London-wide leadership or a conveying power to get boroughs together to make sure that actually, although they've all got individual needs, there's a pan-London approach actually to making sure that every vulnerable Londoner is on some sort of register so we know to get them out?
Well, the Vulnerable Londoner Register is an issue that comes back repeatedly, and a lot of work's been done on that in terms of information sharing. Again, I don't have the details specific here, but I think a lot of those things have been worked through as a result of the COVID pandemic. What I would say is that a different incident might cause different vulnerability, and different people move in and out of vulnerability at various times. So if there was a water shortage or a drought, pregnant women would potentially be vulnerable if they didn't get access to water, but they wouldn't necessarily be on a vulnerable person's register. So I think it is important that we do have information sharing protocols that work at rapid pace when required, but you also need a recognition that actually different people are vulnerable at different points. And I know a number of people, for example, with COVID, who were told they were vulnerable, who had no idea that they would ever be defined as clinically extremely vulnerable and told not to leave their homes.
Thank you both very much.